Now let's talk about the basics of data visualizations and some techniques when it comes to effective design of visuals. So when we're talking about data visualization, we are usually talking about summary tables or graphs that help us summarize the data. Usually, we're dealing with huge amounts of data, and which is hard actually to go through the whole data at once. And because of that, we use data visualization techniques to summarize data in a smaller volume that makes it easier for us as the reader to read the data and interpret, analyze the data, and learn from the data. So we use data visualization usually to get some insights from the data, quick insight from the data, understand if there's any error in the data, and also to identify the patterns, identify the relationship between factors and between variables. So that's actually the first step when it comes to data analysis. After you clean the data, you want to visualize the data and see if you can get some information, get some insight out of your data file, data set, right? So let's just talk about some effective design techniques before we deal with the actual graphs and tables in Excel. So there is a very important concept, data-ink ratio, and it basically means that the ratio itself is basically the ratio between the ink that you use for for conveying the meaning of the data to the audience, the necessary ink for conveying the information to the audience, whereas the whole ink that you use for the visual, right? So the ratio between the data ink relative to the whole ink that you use for the visualization, it's called data ink ratio. And of course, you want to make sure that out of the whole ink that you use for the visual, all of it, ideally speaking, you want all of it to be effectively used, right? So you want to just use the necessary. You want to use the ink if it's necessary. You don't want to use non-data ink, something that is redundant. You don't want to waste your ink, basically, right? So ideally speaking, you want this data ink ratio to be close to 1. All the ink that is used effectively, is used for something that is necessary to convey the meaning of the data to the audience, right? So we have two examples here. We have one table and one graph here. So in the next slide, we have a better design of these visuals. So for this one, for the table, as you can see here, we are using some ink for showing the grid lines here, for showing the border, like cell borders here, which are not really necessary. As you can see, they don't add anything to the information that is meant to be conveyed to the audience here. So there is no value in these lines. They don't separate anything, right? Or if you remove these vertical lines, it's not gonna confuse the reader. Reader is gonna be still able to read this table and understand every single part of this table. Same thing with the horizontal line. Same thing with this line, the line after the headers of the column. We have text here we have numbers. So there is a clear contrast between text and numbers. So we don't need this one. The first horizontal line, you may want to keep that one because You see we have text and we have text here. If you want to remove that, you may want to change the font here and make it, you have to show the contrast, show that this is the table of this is the, basically the title of the table, whereas these are the column headers. When it comes to this one, to the graph, let me just show you a better example of this. And as you can see, this is much cleaner, much neater, and it's easier for the reader to understand. So when you are using, so this is when you have data ink ratio maximized. You see all the inks that is used for this visual, for this table is now important. So you don't have anything that can be removed. Like these are the numbers, these are essential, you can't remove them. The headers, you shouldn't actually remove them. If you remove them, it's going to be hard for the reader to understand and basically interpret the result. Same thing for this one. And like I said about this horizontal line, again, it just makes a contrast between the table title and column header. Next example, this graph. Again, these grid lines, these horizontal grid lines, they don't add any information to the reader here, so they can be easily removed without losing anything in terms of the information. The same information will be shared with the reader even if these grid lines are not there. We don't know, by looking at this graph, we don't know what these numbers are and what these numbers, we don't know these axes basically corresponds to what factor, what variable. So we need to add an axis title, horizontal and vertical. So this is something that we probably have to do. Another thing that might be necessary is that we don't need like all these tickers here. We don't need all these numbers here. We may want to skip some of them. We can have maybe 3, 6, 9, etc., or even 5, 10, 15, etc. You don't have to type all these numbers. As you can see here, we don't have 1, 2, 3 all the way to 50 and so on. We just have 0, 50, 100, and that way we can save some ink without losing anything in terms of, again, conveying the information. When you add the axis title, you don't need to have this sale. The legend becomes redundant, so you can remove that. Again, just compare this one, a bad design, with this one, a better design. And as you can see, this is, so you have the axis title, you put the units. It's usually a very common practice, a very useful practice to do. A nice, clear, basically title for your chart. So moving on. Now we have, for our data visualization, especially for this chapter in our book, we have a choice between, usually we have a choice between tables and graphs. And this is something that is usually up to the user, up to the reader of the report, to the reader of the visual, basically. So tables are perfect, tables are appropriate whenever the reader needs to refer to the specific numerical values. If the reader is interested in knowing the exact, like, decimals, the reader knows to know exactly the details of the numbers, then tables are the best way to summarize the results. When the reader needs to make precise comparison, again, when the reader needs to know the exact value, either for just information, or just for comparison. Again, it's very important to present the detailed values in a table. Whenever, and the third one is probably the most important one here, and is when we have two variables, or multiple variables with different units or very different magnitudes. It's hard to show it in one chart, right? So if you have dollar amounts and you have number of people working, and then so these are, let's say these are two variables plus number of hours that people work in a company, for example. So it's three completely different variables with different units. So you won't be able to put it in a graph that is easily understandable by the readers. So in these cases, it's better to put everything in a table. So here, this is an example where you can present in both format. When we have cost and revenues, both of them are in dollar amount numbers. The magnitude of the numbers are relatively similar. And as you can see, both of them are nice. You can have it in table, you can have it in graphs, so you will be able to compare. So again, some people prefer this one. Depending on the audience, depending on who's going to read this visual, you may want to pick the table or you may want to pick the chart. For most business applications, for marketing people, for a lot of CEOs, usually they prefer to see the graph because as long as they see the revenue is larger than the cost, and as long as they can refer to a table that is attached to your report, they should be fine. Like if they find a point that is interesting to them, as long as the data is saved somewhere, they can just refer to it, and that would answer their question, right? But in order to make the comparison easier with just one look, rather than just taking a close attention to each one of these numbers, it's probably it's probably better to use graphs rather than table for executive managers, right? But still, again, it depends on the application, it depends on the user. In these cases, whenever both of them are possible, sometimes some people prefer to have both actually in like combine both table and graph in one visual, like you see here. That way, the reader does not need to, if something is interesting, if they want to see what is the exact number at this month, they don't need to refer to another attachment. They can just refer to the below of this graph and see the numbers. If you have, this is an example of when you have variables with different units. Like here you have headcount, number of people that are employed, for example, or number of managers, and you have dollar amount of cost and revenue. So you see the magnitude, the type of the numbers are different. This would be very difficult to put it in a graph, and usually it's better to put it in a table. If you want to show it in graph, you usually have to put it in two graphs. There are some ways that you can put them in one graph, but again, it again depends on the reader. The reader may decide to find an innovative way to present these two types, dollar and number of people, in one graph. But typically, this will call for two graphs, actually, two separate graphs, or one combined table. if I want to summarize the table design principles, a few of them: avoid using vertical and horizontal lines whenever possible. They're not, I mean, vertical lines, as long as the columns are, there is a space between a column and another column, you don't really need to have a vertical line. Horizontal lines, again, if the lines are clear, if each row is clear, the reader will not, if there's no horizontal line, if the reader does not get confused, that's fine, you can remove them. But whenever, again, whenever you have a header and the values below it, as long as there is a contrast, you can remove the horizontal line. But if you have, for example, you have the title of your table and then column header similar to what we had, you may want to keep the horizontal line. And this is an example of a different table design. You have same values, same information is presented to the audience, to the reader, through 3 different tables. And as you can see in design D, it's using the least amount of ink, and it's, I mean, the same information is conveyed to the reader. Nothing is missing in terms of the values, in terms of the information that is presented here, right? So it's probably, in terms of the effective design, I would say that the data ink ratio is definitely higher than the other ones, and it's closer to the effective design that we're talking about. Other than the lines, other than saving the inks, you may want to, you may want to come up with creative ways to make the contrast. If you don't want to have the vertical lines to separate the columns, you may want to, just to make it more readable for the audience, for the reader, you may want to use different shades of color. You may want to use different colors, actually, different fields, and that will make it hopefully easier for the reader. So it's really, you should put yourself in the shoes of the readers, the audience, the users of the report, of the tables and graph, and try to basically make it as neat and as clean as possible.